On nights like this, when the air settles softly against the window and the world outside feels quieter than usual, it becomes strangely easy to imagine a different kind of silence, the kind that once wrapped itself around men who wandered into the coldest corners of North America, long before warm houses and electric lights existed. And as you settle into your pillow and feel the weight of the blankets around you, it's comforting to remember that these mountain men, half wild, half tired, and entirely convinced that comfort was a luxury for someone else, knew the cold in a way we no longer do, not as an inconvenience but as a companion that shaped their lives one frozen morning at a time. They were not heroes, and they would have laughed at anyone who tried to call them that, because for them survival was not a brave act but simply the next thing to do, a quiet agreement between their stubborn hearts and the endless winter around them. And in that strange, harsh world, they found truths that modern people have slowly forgotten in the warm glow of central heating and grocery store convenience. Tonight, as you lie there listening to your breath and letting your mind drift, imagine stepping back into that older world, a place where snow didn't fall so much as it built kingdoms, where men lived months at a time without hearing another human voice, and where the fire you built in the evening wasn't for comfort but for survival, a fragile little boundary between life and the enormous sleep of the wilderness around you. This is where our story begins, quietly, slowly, with the cold pressing in from every direction, and a lone man wrapped in furs who has learned to breathe in sync with the winter, because the mountain men understood something we rarely do anymore, that the cold does not hate you. It simply waits for you to stop paying attention. And in that waiting, there was a strange peace. The first thing a mountain man discovered, usually in the very first week away from civilization, was that the cold was not an enemy to be fought, nor a force to be conquered, but a quiet and indifferent presence that never changed its mind. And this realization settled into them slowly, like frost creeping along the edge of a cabin window, shaping their understanding of the world more deeply than any book or sermon ever could. They learned quickly that you could not intimidate the cold by shouting, nor could you bargain with it as you might with a stubborn horse or a reluctant companion, because the cold listened to no one and cared for nothing, and so they stopped trying to reason with it, and instead began to watch it, to feel it, to understand its moods in a way that made survival less heroic and more practical, as though living inside winter was simply another skill a man could learn with time. A mountain man knew the cold not as a sudden shock, but as a slow and constant teacher. He felt it in the snow that squeaked beneath his boots, signaling that the temperature had dropped into a dangerous range, or in the way his breath hung heavy and unmoving in the air, a quiet warning that staying still too long could be a mistake he would not get to repeat. And lying there with frost gathering in his beard, he accepted this not with fear but with a kind of weary respect. Newcomers from the east, with their wool coats and optimism, always cursed loudly when the wind hit them sideways, but the old trappers barely reacted at all, because they had long since understood that you only curse what listens, and the cold never did. Instead, it waited patiently for a man to be careless, to sleep too far from the fire, to misjudge how wet his boots had become, or to believe that daylight alone meant safety. And so each morning the mountain man woke slowly, feeling for his fingers and toes before he opened his eyes, because warmth in such a place was not a guarantee, but a reward for caution. And as he stretched under stiff hides and whispered a quiet curse at the frozen world around him, he accepted again the simple truth that had kept him alive. The cold wasn't cruel, it was simply honest. And if you respected it, it sometimes let you wake up for one more day. As the days and nights drifted past in a slow, frozen rhythm, the mountain man began to understand that the real conversation with the cold was never spoken aloud, but carried in silence, because out here, in the high and lonely spine of the continent, winter had its own language made of small, easily overlooked signals. The brittle squeak of snow beneath his boots, the sharp sting of air that bit at his lungs when he breathed too quickly, the eerie stillness of the woods just before a storm, and he learned to listen to all of it with a quiet, patient focus, as though every shift in the wind or absence of sound were a sentence in a book no one read to you anymore, one you had to interpret alone in the dim light of morning. At first the silence weighed heavily on him, because he hadn't grown up with it. Men who came from towns or from crowded villages were used to noise, to the clatter of tools, to laughter from neighbors, to voices calling across streets. But here in the mountains there was another kind of quiet, a thick, unmoving, almost ancient stillness that the old trappers sometimes called the white silence, not because it was beautiful but because it was absolute. And in that silence, if you shouted, the echo came back so faint and so quickly that it felt as if the world itself was gently reminding you how small you really were. But over time, the silence stopped feeling like a threat, and instead became a tool, because when nothing clamoured for his attention except wind, snow, and his own slow footsteps, he started noticing details he would have missed in any other life. The way the snow squeaked meant the temperature had dropped below safety. The way it crunched told him he had a little more room to breathe, and the snow that made no sound at all, that soft, sinking, suffocating silence, warned him he was now in a place where the body faltered faster than the mind was willing to admit. The forest spoke just as clearly if you knew how to listen. A sudden shift in the wind threading through the pines was not just weather, it was a message that the sky was preparing something personal, while an unexpected stillness in the branches meant a predator, or perhaps simply the cold itself, was leaning in closer, curious about him in the way the wilderness always was, neither hostile nor forgiving, simply watching. And in those quiet hours when even his thoughts seemed muted by the vastness around him, he began to realize that what kept a mountain man alive was not strength or bravado, but attention, deep, unwavering attention to the subtle movements of the world, to the faint signals the cold offered before it decided to take something precious from him, a warning measured not in words but in the soft exhale of winter drifting between the trees. As the weeks slowly folded into one another, the mountain man discovered that surviving the cold was less a matter of courage and more a matter of noticing the invisible bargains the wilderness offered him, because every hour spent in that frozen world came with a quiet exchange, attention for safety, humility for mercy, and patience for warmth. And the men who understood this unspoken contract lived longer than the ones who tried to meet winter with bravado or stubbornness. He learned that even the simplest tasks gained layers of meaning under the weight of the cold. Tying a bootlace became a negotiation between numb fingers and fading daylight. Lighting a fire turned into a slow argument with wood that refused to catch, and crossing a creek meant assessing not just the ice but the air, the slope of the bank, the pattern of snow around the edges, and the subtle tension in the wind that suggested how quickly everything could change if he misjudged a single step. Walking through deep snow taught him discipline more effectively than any lecture ever could, because every misstep drained strength he would need later. Every careless movement sank him deeper into the drifts, and every hurried breath stole warmth from his chest. So he learned to move with a slow, deliberate grace, placing each foot exactly where it needed to go, breathing in long measured pulls, letting his body adapt to the rhythm of the land, as though he were a part of it rather than an intruder. Sometimes, when the sky was a hard, pale grey and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath, he could smell a storm before it arrived, a faint metallic scent mixed with the sharp bite of coming snow, and in those moments he would pause, close his eyes, and listen to the silence deepen around him, because storms did not sneak up on men who paid attention. They announced themselves in whispers long before the first flakes began to fall. Animals spoke too in their own quiet ways. Crows flying low meant snow was heavy in the air. Wolves falling silent meant the storm had already arrived somewhere unseen. And even the rabbits left messages in the patterns of their tracks, hints about danger or shifting winds or predators moving through the underbrush. And the mountain man learned to read these signs with the same steady focus someone else might reserve for scripture or maps. His breath became a barometer of sorts. the clouds of steam drifting from his mouth, rising or curling or dissipating depending on the air's temperament, and some nights when the cold pressed down hard enough to make even the trees groan, he would sit beside his small fire and watch his own breath mingle with the smoke, feeling in his bones the truth that had kept generations of mountain men alive. You didn't outthink the cold, you outwatched it, outlistened it, outwaited it. And in this endless cycle of noticing, adjusting and enduring, he found a strange calm, a quiet acceptance that the cold was not an adversary to defeat, but a presence to understand, a teacher whose lessons were carved into your bones, and whose tests arrived without warning, carried on the whispering breath of winter drifting softly between the pines. As the cold settled deeper into the land and the days shrank into thin bands of pale light, the mountain man began to understand fire not as a comfort, but as a kind of fragile miracle, something small and flickering that existed only because he had coaxed it into life with frozen fingers and stubborn breath. A brief rebellion against the vast indifference of winter, and every evening as he crouched beside the tiny orange glow, he felt again that humbling awareness that warmth was never guaranteed, only borrowed. Starting a fire in good weather was easy enough, but in the mountains good weather was a rumor, not a promise, so most nights found him kneeling over damp bark and reluctant tinder, striking steel against flint with a patience so steady it bordered on prayer, and as sparks scattered like tiny stars across the dark, he understood that this was the oldest conversation humans had ever held with nature, a negotiation between what the world allowed and what a man refused to surrender. Sometimes the fire took quickly, catching along the edges of dry moss or bits of shredded bark he'd kept tucked in his pocket for such moments, and sometimes it fought him, demanding more breath, more persistence, more of that quiet desperation that rose in the chest when the wind hissed cold against the back of your neck. But no matter how long it took, when that first thin thread of smoke finally curled upward, he felt the same silent relief wash through him, a steadying of the heartbeat, a loosening of the shoulders, as though the fire were whispering, "Just for a moment, you get to stay." And once the flame grew into something steady, something that crackled and glowed and warmed the tips of his boots like an old friend reaching out, he would sit with his back to the wind, letting the heat seep slowly through his stiff layers, and watch the shadows dance across the snow in shapes that felt ancient and familiar, as if generations of men before him had sat in the same posture, breathing the same cold air, warmed by flames almost identical to this one. Out there, fire wasn't just heat, it was a companion, a small circle of civilization pushed into a wilderness that barely tolerated it. And the mountain man felt that companionship deeply on the loneliest nights, when the dark pressed close and the forest creaked and groaned in the wind like a living thing. He spoke to the fire sometimes, quietly, in the way a man talks to a dog or a weary horse, not expecting answers, but seeking the comfort of hearing his own voice, carried softly through the smoke. Steam curled from the edges of his coat, as the warmth slowly thawed the frost caught in the seams, and he would extend his hands toward the flames, palms up, fingers stiff at first, then loosening, relaxing, remembering the shape of life after a day spent gripping tools, reins, rifles, and cold itself, and in those small, wordless moments he understood why mountain men guarded embers as if they were treasure, why they wrapped coals in bark and moss to carry them from camp to camp, keeping a little piece of yesterday's warmth alive for tomorrow's cold. The fire taught him lessons as clear as anything the land offered. That warmth was always temporary, that complacency was dangerous, and that survival was a skill practiced in tiny deliberate acts, repeated over and over again, feeding the flames, shielding them, tending them as though they were something sacred, because in a world ruled by ice, they were. And as he drifted closer to sleep, wrapped in furs with the fire's glow flickering gently across his face, he let the crackle and hiss become a lullaby of sorts, a reminder that for this one night at least, winter had allowed him a small corner of light, a thin but precious boundary between life and the long, endless hush of the cold, waiting patiently just beyond the reach of the flame. As the long winter deepened and the days became little more than pale interruptions between nights, the mountain man learned that clothing was not simply something he wore, but something he negotiated with, because every layer he wrapped around his body was less about comfort and more about survival, and each thread of fur or wool carried its own silent history of storms endured and mistakes learned from the hard way, so that by the time he stepped out into the frozen morning air, he felt as though he were wearing not garments but decisions. He no longer put on his clothing with the casual ease of a man dressing indoors. Instead, he layered himself slowly, thoughtfully, almost ritualistically, beginning with the inner shirt scratchy wool that clung to the skin like a second hide, then the vest that held warmth close to his ribs, then the heavy coat that stiffened in the cold until it felt carved from bark, and finally the thick mantle of fur draped across his shoulders, so large and cumbersome that it made him resemble some wandering creature of the forest rather than a man, and in a way that was exactly what he needed to become to survive. The furs held scents of smoke, of pine, of snowmelt, and of days when the cold had gnawed through every layer and still found skin beneath. There were patches where the fire had singed the edges, seams that told stories of falls and frozen nights, bindings made from animal sinew, when thread had broken under pressure, and each flaw reminded him that these clothes were not tools of vanity but armor, and like all armor they bore the marks of battles fought quietly against a world that did not care if he won. He accepted the weight of his clothing without complaint, because the mountain men knew that the heaviness of fur was merely the price of continuing to wake up each morning, and even though the layers restricted his movement and made his footsteps slow, they gave him something far more valuable: time, a few more hours of warmth before the cold seeped through the seams and reached for him with its quiet, icy patience. Washing those layers was never considered. Water froze, soap froze, and even if they tried, the garments would stiffen into ice sculptures, shaped vaguely like men. So they wore the same clothing season after season until the smell became part of them, a blend of smoke, sweat, animal oils, and winter itself, and that scent, pungent and unchanging, was a sign of experience, a badge of endurance, something even wolves understood, for they often scented a mountain man long before they saw him and chose wisely to keep their distance. Boots were their own burden, always damp, always stiff, always betraying you at the worst moment, and tying the frozen laces each morning felt like folding your fingers into knots of numbness and determination. But once they were on, he felt anchored to the land, grounded in a way that reminded him he belonged to this cold world as much as anything else living out here. And yet, for all the discomfort and weight, these layers gave him a strange comfort too, because when you spend weeks alone in a silent world, wrapped in furs thick enough to feel like another being pressed against your back, the weight becomes a sort of companionship, a reminder that you are still here, that something touches you even when no human hand does, and that the cold, despite its vastness, has not claimed you today. He learned to accept the small irritations, the stiff collar, the damp cuffs, the fur that collected frost until it sparkled like glass, because each of these was a sign that he had not misjudged the cold, that he had prepared well enough to keep moving. And the mountain man understood more clearly with every passing dawn that warmth was never a guarantee granted by the world, but a privilege earned through layers, labor, and the willingness to live each day as though it were another quiet test. And so he stepped out into the morning snow, wrapped in his heavy, scarred, imperfect clothing, breathing softly into the icy air, feeling the world press against him in a cold embrace that did not welcome him yet, did not reject him either. And as he began his slow walk across the frozen land, he carried with him the ancient truth that every mountain man learned eventually. Insulation was not just protection, it was permission to keep going, permission to endure, permission to see one more sunrise in a place where sunrise itself felt like a small miracle. As the winter stretched into its long, unbroken rhythm, the mountain man began to see food not as a pleasure or a comfort, but as a slow-burning fuel that kept his body from surrendering to the cold, because out here, eating was not about taste or satisfaction. It was about keeping the fire inside him alive for one more day, and every bite he took, no matter how tough or frozen or unappealing, was a reminder that survival was built on small, steady acts of nourishment rather than moments of indulgence. He learned early that the cold cared nothing for appetite. It demanded calories the way a blaze demands wood, and if you fell behind in feeding it, even for a day, the winter would slip quietly into your bones and drain your strength strand by strand, leaving you light-headed, slow, and dangerously numb. So he ate the way mountain men always had, with a kind of solemn practicality, chewing not because he enjoyed it, but because it meant he would still be able to walk when the sun rose. Meat became his closest ally, and his harshest teacher. Beaver tail rich in fat might keep him warm through the night, while elk tongue felt like a feast, but more often he found himself gnawing on dried jerky, so tough it fought his teeth more fiercely than the animals ever had in life. And yet even that stubborn dryness became something he respected, because if the meat made his jaw ache, it usually meant it would keep him alive a little longer. He learned to cook directly on the coals when the fire allowed it, though more often the cold won that argument, forcing him to warm his food half-heartedly or eat it frozen, crunching through stiff edges that tasted more of winter than of anything once living. And in those moments he found a strange humor in the situation, because eating frozen coffee or stew that had turned into an icy block was not a sign of failure, but simply another reminder that the mountains played by their own rules. On good weeks, if the traps were kind and the weather allowed a steady hand, he might boil rabbit into a thick stew flavored only by smoke and survival, and the warmth of it seeped into him like a blessing, not because of its taste. There was hardly any, but because he could feel it spreading through his limbs, loosening the stiffness that winter had pressed into his joints, giving him a brief, tender reprieve from the relentless cold. On bad weeks, he ate whatever moved slower than he did, or whatever hadn't spoiled enough to revolt him entirely. He learned that hunger erased pride more quickly than exhaustion, and once, after days of poor luck, he boiled leather from an old boot, scraping off the softened strands and swallowing them with the grim determination of a man who knew that dignity was a luxury for warmer climates. Salt, when he had it, was worth more than any coin, because a handful could keep meat edible for weeks, and a pinch could make jerky taste a little less like regret. And when there was no salt, he smoked what he could, stuffing meat near the fire, letting the smoke thicken and cling to it until it carried the rough flavor of survival rather than the sourness of decay. Every part of an animal had value to him, the bones for broth, the fat for warmth, the hides for shelter, the sinew for thread, and nothing was wasted, because out here waste was a kind of arrogance. The mountains didn't forgive, and the mountain man had long since traded arrogance for endurance. Sometimes, when the wind settled and the sky softened into a pale wash of evening, he would sit with his simple meal cupped in his hands and feel a strange gratitude rise in him, not for the taste, not for the texture, but for the quiet knowledge that this food, however humble, however meagre, was the thin boundary keeping him on the living side of winter. And in that moment he understood what modern people rarely do, that eating is not just nourishment but an act of defiance, a gentle refusal to let the cold decide everything. As the night hours stretched long and quiet across the mountains, the mountain man discovered that sleep itself was not something granted, but something negotiated, a fragile truce he entered into with the cold, because in a world where warmth slipped away faster than rest could replace it, lying down to sleep was less an invitation to dreams and more a temporary surrender to exhaustion, offered with the hope that nothing hungry or freezing would decide otherwise while his eyes were closed. He didn't think of sleep the way modern people do, as rest or comfort or a chance to drift peacefully into another world. He thought of it as a pause, a momentary dimming of the senses during which every part of him remained half awake, half listening, half waiting, because he knew that deep sleep in a place like this was not simply dangerous. It was foolish, like stepping away from your fire when the wind was rising, or ignoring the sudden quiet of wolves in the distance. Most nights he slept in fits, curled beneath layers of stiff hides, each breath rising in pale clouds that froze along the fur before melting again, as his own body heat struggled to hold its ground, and he learned to drift only a few minutes at a time, waking often to feed the fire with whatever small scraps he'd gathered before the dark settled in. Because if the flames flickered low, even for a short while, the cold pressed in close enough to steal warmth straight from his bones. The ground offered no softness, only the hard reassurance of earth that did not care whether he slept well, and he often burrowed into snow rather than lying on open rock or frozen dirt, shaping a hollow with his hands and body heat until it became a crude shelter. It was counterintuitive to anyone who had not lived through such winters, but the snow, for all its bite and bitterness, insulated him from the wind, and trapped a thin pocket of warmth that felt almost like kindness. His pillow, when he had one, was a saddle or a bundled coat, and sometimes, if fortune pushed him into a place desperate enough for creativity, the warm flank of a half-exhausted horse served as a temporary resting place, the animal's slow breathing matching his own as they borrowed warmth from each other, two lonely creatures wrapped together against a world that seemed intent on freezing the softness out of everything. Sleeping beside the fire was both a blessing and a threat, because the same flames that kept his face warm could easily send a stray spark onto his clothing, and mountain men learned early to position themselves just far enough from the dancing embers to stay safe, but close enough that the cold would not tug them awake with stinging fingers of frost, and every night became a careful balancing act between danger and necessity. Dreaming was rare. The cold was too present, too demanding, too insistent to let the mind wander deeply, and most dreams were little more than flickers, half memories of warm kitchens long gone, half illusions of summer grass, and he woke from them with a dull ache in his chest, knowing that nostalgia was a luxury he could not afford, not when the morning required his full strength and focus simply to exist. When dawn finally arrived, often without colour, just a slow lightening of the sky that made the world look as though it had been carved from ice, he woke not refreshed but relieved, because waking meant he had managed the fragile truce for one more night, and as he shifted beneath his frozen layers, and checked whether his fingers still responded, he felt again that quiet gratitude known only to those who have slept inches from death. Not joy, not triumph, but a simple acknowledgement that morning had come, and he was still here to greet it. And so he rose, stiff and slow, brushing frost from his beard, and gathering the little warmth left in the embers, coaxing them back into a flame that would warm his hands enough to begin the day. And as he stepped into the cold, he understood what modern life rarely teaches, that sleep is not always comfort. Sometimes it is endurance, a steady, patient holding on until the sun decides to return. As the days unfolded in their slow, icy succession, the mountain man came to understand that his tools were less objects and more lifelines, each one carrying the weight of responsibility, history, and the quiet expectation that he would use them wisely, or pay the immediate and unforgiving price for failing to do so, because in a world where metal stiffened, wood cracked, and leather froze brittle as bark, even simple tools demanded respect. His rifle, for example, was not merely a weapon. It was a companion shaped by weather and wear, a temperamental creation that misfired when the cold found its way into the lock, that sulked and refused cooperation when frost coated the barrel, and that required constant, meticulous attention, wiping, warming, and coaxing like a creature that needed frequent reassurance to function. And he knew that on the days when it failed, he could not blame the rifle any more than a sailor could blame the sea. It was simply winter reminding him that everything mechanical was only temporarily reliable. His knife, chipped and scarred from cutting frozen hide and bone, was another source of both frustration and pride, because it carried the story of every camp he had built, every meal he had carved from stubborn flesh, every branch he had trimmed for firewood, and though its edge dulled quickly in the cold, he sharpened it with the same patience he used on his fire, knowing that the blade's temper mirrored his own persistence. If he neglected it, even for a day, winter would take advantage of the lapse. The traps he carried clanked softly against one another like small metallic warnings, each one a puzzle of tension and precision that grew stiff and uncooperative when temperatures fell below what the metal preferred, and he spent long minutes in the snow adjusting them, breathing warm air onto joints that barely moved, fixing springs with fingers stiff enough to betray him at any moment, because these traps, imperfect, unforgiving, and often stubborn, were the difference between hunger and the simple comfort of knowing he had food for the next few nights. Even the smallest items mattered in ways that modern hands rarely consider a length of sinew for tying gear together. Strips of leather warmed over the fire to soften them before being used as binding, bits of cord made from bark, each piece chosen not for its appearance but for its reliability, and each one treated like a thread holding him to the fragile edge of survival. Because nothing was disposable out here, not even the tiniest scrap. And towering above all these humble pieces of metal and hide was the hatchet, his constant companion, the oldest and most essential tool he owned, a piece of iron that served every purpose from splitting wood to building shelters, to expressing, on particularly cold mornings, his private frustrations with the world in the form of aggressive hacking at frozen logs. It was the only tool he trusted completely, because it was the only one that never pretended to be more than it was: simple, honest, effective. The mountain man carried these tools across countless miles of snow and forest, and each one bore signs of wear that told stories more clearly than words ever could. The bent notch in the rifle's stock from slipping on ice, the darkened patina on the knife from too many fireside meals, the trap with a spring that clicked unevenly after surviving one winter too many, and the hatchet with a handle polished smooth by his hands over seasons of use. All of them formed a quiet archive of his time in the mountains, proof that even the simplest objects could become chapters of a life lived in cold and silence. But the greatest tool he carried was not metal or leather or wood. It was his tolerance, the quiet resilience that hardened inside him with each task completed, despite numb fingers or aching bones, because out here willpower replaced luxury and patience replaced comfort, and this inner endurance, this strange mixture of stubbornness and acceptance, proved to be sharper than his knife, sturdier than his rifle, and more essential than any hatchet he could swing. As he trudged through the snow, his tools clattering softly like a traveling workshop, he understood something modern life rarely teaches: that survival is not built on perfect equipment, but on the willingness to use imperfect tools with determination, care, and the quiet faith that effort, even when painful and slow, was the only real advantage a man had against the winter. As the winter pressed deeper into his bones, and the days demanded more of him than any man should reasonably give, the mountain man began to understand that his body itself was becoming a tool shaped by the cold, sculpted with a relentless patience that civilization could never imitate. Because out here, endurance was not a virtue but a requirement, and the human form adapted not through comfort but through suffering that repeated itself quietly, day after day, until pain no longer felt like a warning but like a familiar rhythm of existence. At first, when he was still new to the mountains, the cold struck him like an insult, sharp, personal, unforgiving, making his skin sting, his muscles lock, and his breath drag in painful bursts. But after weeks of trudging through knee-deep snow, sleeping in cramped shelters, and waking to frost clinging to his beard like fine glass, his body began to shift in ways he only half understood. Nerves dulled, joints stiffened into a manageable ache, and his bloodstream learned to move faster, burning calories like dry tinder to keep the inner fire alive. Soon his fingers, once clumsy with cold, began moving with a strange automatic precision, able to tie knots, fix traps, and split kindling even when numbness blurred the sensation of touch. His feet, battered from endless wet boots and frozen ground, hardened until they felt less like limbs and more like hooves, built for trudging across terrain that made softer men hesitate, and his skin thickened against the wind in a way that felt almost animal, as though the cold had taught it a new language of endurance. He no longer flinched when the wind slashed sideways against his face, nor did he complain when the cold burned its way into his lungs, because his mind and body had reached a quiet agreement. Discomfort was unavoidable, and resistance only wasted energy, so he adapted by absorbing the cold rather than fighting it, letting it settle into his muscles like a second, harsher heartbeat that reminded him he was still alive. After enough time, he found that pain no longer commanded his attention the way it once had. It became background noise, a steady companion like the creak of frozen branches or the distant howl of wolves, and he learned to move through it rather than around it, accepting the aches of frostbitten toes, strained shoulders and cracked knuckles as part of the daily cost of survival, just as a sailor accepts saltwater sores or a blacksmith accepts burns, simple evidence of doing the work required to continue. Mental resilience came without ceremony, forged not in moments of bravery, but in long stretches of monotony. Hours spent trudging through snowdrifts, nights spent feeding the fire, mornings spent scraping frost from tools, and in these slow repetitions, his mind learned not to wander, not to panic, but to rest inside the rhythm of effort, allowing him to endure discomfort with a calmness that surprised even him. He found himself sitting still for long periods, watching a trapline, tracking an animal's movements, or simply listening to the forest breathe, and the cold, instead of feeling hostile or oppressive, became a kind of quiet mentor, teaching him patience, teaching him to conserve energy, teaching him that most threats dissolved once a man stopped fearing them and started understanding them. By the time he realized how much he had changed, he was no longer the man who had arrived here. He had become something else, something shaped by snow and silence, and the steady pressure of winter pressing against him, a creature of endurance with frost always sitting lightly on his beard and calm always sitting lightly in his chest, the cold no longer startling him but simply moving with him the way a shadow follows a flame. Modern people might call this grit or resilience, but to him it was simply life, nothing noble, nothing extraordinary, just the result of countless days spent refusing to quit, refusing to yield, and refusing to let the cold decide who he would become. And in this quiet transformation, he discovered the oldest lesson the mountains had to offer, the one carved into every ridge and buried in every gust of wind. Strength is not chosen, it is shaped, slowly, painfully, patiently, until the body becomes capable of what the mind once doubted. As the long winter carved itself deeper into the land, the mountain man began to understand pain not as an intruder but as a companion, a constant presence that drifted beside him like a shadow of the cold itself. And with each passing day he learned that pain in the wilderness did not arrive with fanfare or demand attention. It simply settled into his joints, his fingertips, his shoulders, becoming part of the quiet landscape he moved through, as natural as the sound of snow shifting under his boots, or the low moan of wind threading its way through frozen trees. Pain greeted him each morning before he even opened his eyes. It lived in his stiff knees, his swollen knuckles, the raw cracks along his hands where winter had peeled back, the softness of skin like bark curling away from a tree, and as he stretched beneath frozen furs, he felt all of it awaken with him, not as punishment but as a reminder that he had survived the night's long negotiations with cold and darkness. He stopped treating pain as something to fight, because fighting took energy the cold demanded for survival, and instead he learned to move through it with a slow, patient acceptance, understanding that every ache was simply part of the body's ongoing conversation with winter, some pains sharp and quick, others dull and lingering, but all of them familiar enough to become a kind of quiet background music to his days. Cuts and blisters became everyday truths, not emergencies, a knife slip here, a frost-bitten fingertip there, a bruised shin from stumbling over a hidden log under deep snow. These were not moments of alarm, but small entries in an unspoken ledger of survival, because he knew that pain meant the body still felt something, still fought back, and the real danger was numbness, that cold, creeping silence that spread across the skin like a whisper of death. If a wound bled, he pressed snow against it and kept moving. If frostbite darkened the edges of his toes, he wrapped them tighter and walked until the dull throb became bearable. If joints swelled from endless days of lifting, hauling, cutting, and trudging, he reminded himself that the mountain men before him had carried worse burdens with less complaint, and that in the grand equation of winter, pain was simply a tax he paid for existence. Illness was met with the same stoic practicality. There were no doctors in the wilderness, no bandages beyond scraps of hide or cloth soaked in melted snow, no medicines except whiskey and stubbornness, and so he treated sickness, not as a crisis, but as another cold front passing through his body, something to endure with quiet patience, to outwait with sleep and small sips of warmth, trusting that his body, hardened now by months of cold, would do what it had learned to do, survive without asking for permission. And yet, for all this acceptance, pain also sharpened him, honing his senses with a strange clarity, making him aware of every shift in temperature, every tremor of fatigue, every warning his body sent about cold creeping too deep or exhaustion settling too heavily. Because pain, for all its cruelty, was honest, and in a world where the cold cared for nothing and no one, honesty was a gift he learned to treasure. It simplified his world, stripping away the clutter of unnecessary thoughts until all that mattered was the next breath, the next step, the next spark of fire. When everything hurt, the mind stopped wandering into fear or regret, focusing instead on the sheer effort of being alive in a place that demanded awareness in every moment. Modern people talk about discomfort as though it is something unusual, something to be avoided or soothed at the first sign of inconvenience. But for the mountain man, pain was simply proof that he had not frozen, that he still possessed a body warm enough to hurt, and in that strange, harsh logic, pain became a reassurance rather than a warning, a sign that he was still here, still moving, still part of the living world, despite the cold pressing against him from every direction. And so, day after day, he carried his pain with the same quiet endurance he carried his tools and his furs, knowing that winter respected nothing except persistence, and that as long as he accepted the ache without surrendering to it, he would continue walking through the snow, breathing into the cold, and shaping himself, piece by piece, into the kind of man the mountains did not easily break. As the weeks unfolded into months and the mountains wrapped themselves in deeper layers of silence, the mountain man realized that solitude was not merely a condition of his life, it was the atmosphere he breathed, a presence that lingered at the edges of every campfire and followed him across every snow-covered ridge, shaping his thoughts with the same slow austerity that winter used to shape the land, smoothing away the noise of the world until only the essential parts of him remained. At first, solitude felt like an emptiness, a vast hollow that stretched between one frozen sunrise and the next, and he found himself talking aloud to no one in particular, just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. But as time passed and the mountains drew him deeper into their quiet logic, he learned that the absence of company was not the same as loneliness, and that being alone in such a place carried its own strange kind of companionship. The steady rhythm of the wind, the creaking of pines shifting under snow, the soft hiss of his fire, each sound reminding him that the world was still here, vast and present, even when no other human being was near enough to hear him breathe. He made companions of the things he carried. His rifle leaned near the door of his shelter like a silent guardian. His hatchet, polished by the grip of his hand, felt almost like an extension of his will. His knife, familiar and worn, held the quiet reliability of an old friend, and even his fire, flickering low at night, became a voice he trusted, the crackle and his filling the long hours when darkness pressed close and sleep came in fragmented pieces. Animals too offered their own kind of company. The dog that sometimes followed him from camp to camp, tail low, breath steaming in the cold. The horse whose steady warmth lulled him towards sleep on the harshest nights. Even the wolves, distant shadows slipping through the trees, reminded him that he was never truly alone, only far from people, which was not always the same thing. His echo became something familiar, returning to him across the frozen spaces, like a faint conversation with a quieter version of himself, and he found comfort in it, because in a land where nothing stayed warm for long, even a reflected voice felt like proof that he existed in more than one moment, that the cold had not swallowed him entirely. But solitude was not always gentle. There were days when the sky hung heavy and white for so long that it seemed the world had forgotten colour altogether, days when the silence deepened into something close to accusation, when every thought felt too loud, too sharp, too capable of echoing in uncomfortable places inside him. On those days he felt the weight of his own mind pressing down like a second winter layered over the first, and he understood why some men cracked under the strain, why they spoke to trees or shouted into storms or abandoned their camps entirely, wandering into the snow with no clear sense of direction, trying to escape the feeling that the world had grown too large while they themselves had grown too small. To survive solitude, the mountain man learned to fill the empty spaces with purpose, checking trap lines, mending gear, cutting wood, brushing snow from his shelter, tasks that kept his hands busy and his thoughts grounded, because idleness was dangerous in a place where the mind could turn inward too sharply, cutting where no blade should. He found rituals that steadied him, sharpening his knife by the fire at night, boiling water even when he wasn't thirsty, talking softly to his horse as he tightened its reins, or tracing maps from memory on the inside of his coat, reminding himself that beyond these valleys lay other places, other paths, other people who existed even if he could not see them. And slowly, solitude ceased to feel like a burden and became something closer to a teacher, one that revealed truths too quiet to hear in crowded places. He learned how his own thoughts moved when they weren't pushed or crowded, learned the difference between fear and instinct, between loneliness and peace, between craving companionship and craving noise. He discovered that beneath all the layers of silence, the human heart grows clearer, beating with a steadiness that no distraction can obscure, and in the stillness of those long nights, wrapped in furs with only the fire to witness his breath rising into the cold, he felt something close to peace, a peace earned not through comfort, but through understanding himself in a way only the mountains could teach. As the winter wore on, and the long nights pressed against the world like a vast, unmoving weight, the mountain man began to understand fire not merely as warmth, but as civilization distilled into a single fragile circle of light, a force so small it could fit between his palms yet powerful enough to hold back the infinite cold, and every time he knelt to coax a spark from flint and steel, he felt as though he was participating in an ancient ritual older than memory itself, a ritual shared by every human who had ever faced the dark and refused to be swallowed by it. Fire was his anchor, his companion, his shield, his confessional, and his only source of softness in a world carved almost entirely from ice. And when he managed to catch a spark on a curl of bark or a scrap of tinder warmed near his chest, he treated it with the reverence one reserves for something sacred, cupping his hands around the faint glow, whispering breath onto it, feeding it gently until it grew into a small flame, then a steady one, then finally a living, crackling presence that cast a trembling amber circle on the snow. Getting a fire lit on a calm day was satisfying. Getting one to survive a blizzard felt like earning a blessing from the mountain itself. The wind would howl through the trees, tearing at the flames, trying to scatter them into nothing, and he would hunch over the fire like a human shield, shoulders curved inward, hands trembling not from fear but from cold, holding his breath each time the flames guttered, praying with a kind of wordless desperation that they would catch again, because he knew better than anyone that without fire the night would swallow him whole long before dawn arrived. He learned to read flames the way other men read books, knowing which crackle meant the wood was damp, which hiss warned that the bark was too green, which pop signaled the fire had settled into a comfortable burn. He knew how to stack the logs so they breathed, how to feed them slowly, how to coax heat from coals that looked dead, until his breath stirred them into faint red pulses like the slow heartbeat of something ancient. On calm nights when the snow drifted downward in soft spirals and the wind softened into a low murmur, he would sit beside the fire with his knees pulled close, letting the warmth seep into his bones while the shadows danced around him like stories he could almost understand. And in those moments, the fire felt not merely like heat but like memory, a reminder of other men in other winters, all of them crouching by flames just like this one, surviving the night with the help of the same fragile miracle. But fire was not always kind. It punished laziness, forgot loyalty, and vanished the moment you grew too confident. A single gust could strip away hours of work. A careless spark could ignite the furs at your feet. A moment of inattention could mean waking to silence so cold and complete. It felt like standing inside a grave made of frost. The mountain men learned early that fire demanded respect with the same stern certainty as the cold. It offered warmth, but expected vigilance. And if you failed to give it your full attention, you paid for it in a currency colder than snow. Sometimes he carried coals from one camp to the next, wrapped inside a bundle of bark or moss tucked near his chest, letting the faint heat mingle with his breath until he reached a new clearing and coaxed the half-living embers back into flame. And as he watched the fire catch, watched it breathe, watched it begin its delicate fight against the darkness, he felt again the strange mixture of relief and reverence that came with surviving another night. Near the fire, the mountain man felt something he rarely admitted to himself, a sense of belonging, of being tethered to a fragile strand of human history that wound through centuries of cold nights and tired hands. The fire was a reminder that even in the most indifferent winter, even under the most unforgiving sky, a single spark was enough to push back the darkness for one more hour, one more breath, one more moment of warmth. And so he guarded it, fed it, spoke to it, trusted it, because in a world built from silence and frost, the fire was the one thing that asked nothing of him except care, and gave him in return the only thing he could not survive without, a little piece of light in the endless white quiet. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer than the days by margins that felt almost impossible, the mountain man learned that the cold itself was never the true antagonist. It was merely the setting, the vast indifferent stage on which every task, every error, every small victory took place, because what truly challenged him were the decisions he made inside that cold, the moments where instinct and caution needed to outweigh pride or impatience, and he understood more clearly with each passing week that winter didn't punish men, it simply waited for them to punish themselves. In this frozen world he began to notice that the cold had a way of amplifying every feeling and muting every distraction, sharpening his senses while dulling his comforts, so that he became hyper-aware of every shift in the wind, every subtle change in the snow's texture, every moment when the sky looked just a shade too still. And in that awareness he found himself reading the landscape, the way a scholar reads a manuscript, slowly, attentively, searching not for beauty but for warning. He noticed how snow could speak in a dozen voices, the crisp, sharp squeak of bitter cold that meant danger was close, the soft, heavy crunch that signaled safer, warmer weather, the nearly soundless glide of deep powder that swallowed footsteps and tested endurance. And he learned to listen to these sounds the way he listened to his own heartbeat at night, steady and informative, reminders that the world was always telling him just enough to survive if he was willing to hear. The wind gave lessons too, though it spoke in harsher tones, carrying scents of coming storms or sudden shifts in the air, brushing past his face with icy fingers that hinted at whether he should keep moving or hunker down. And over time he learned to tilt his head slightly, feeling the direction of the gusts the way a sailor reads the ocean. trusting that the wind knew what he needed to know, long before the sky revealed anything. He paid attention to the silence as well, because silence in the mountains was not uniform. There was the soft contemplative silence of a calm morning, where even the trees seemed to rest, and then there was the tight, compressed silence that arrived before something dangerous, the kind that made the animals vanish, the air tighten, and the forest stop breathing. In that sudden hush, he knew to prepare, to gather wood, to secure his shelter, to settle himself for a storm that would stretch the night into a long, cold trial of patience and resolve. Even the animals taught him crows flying low meant snow was on its way, wolves falling silent meant something larger was approaching, and deer moving restlessly through the trees signaled a shift in weather severe enough to stir every living thing. And he observed all of these details with a calm discipline, knowing that nature offered warnings more generously than it offered mercy. Modern people would call it intuition, but he knew better. Intuition was a romantic word for what the mountain men earned through countless hours of watching, listening, failing, and surviving. And it was not magic or instinct that guided him, but the accumulation of countless tiny observations, layered one atop the other, like frost crystals building on a window pane. This awareness became as vital to him as food or fire or shelter, because understanding the cold, really understanding it, not just fearing it, meant embracing the idea that winter was not a force to be outsmarted or defeated, but a presence to be acknowledged, studied, and respected, like a quiet teacher, whose lessons came in subtle signs rather than spoken words. And so, day after day, as he walked through the crystalline quiet of snow-covered valleys or climbed the ridges hardened by wind and ice, he carried with him the understanding that winter was never the enemy, complacency was, arrogance was, ignorance was, but the cold itself was simply the truth of the land, a truth that demanded humility and rewarded attention. By learning to read the smallest signs, the way branches bent under snow, the way frost gathered in patterns on his gear, the way clouds thickened at the horizon, he stayed one step ahead of danger, not through strength or daring, but through patience, a patience born from the quiet acceptance that the cold cared nothing for his survival, and thus forced him to care even more. As the season moved into its harshest stretch, and the cold settled with the heavy certainty of something that intended to stay, the mountain man came to understand that the truest lesson the wilderness offered was humility, because in a world carved from ice and silence, where storms hid behind every ridge, and the night arrived with a weight that seemed almost physical, there was no room for pride, no space for ego, only the steady acknowledgement that survival depended entirely on his ability to listen, observe, and adapt. He realized that the cold did not test him with great dramatic challenges or sudden crises. Instead, it examined him in small, relentless ways, how he placed his feet on uneven snow, how he protected his fire against the wind, how he conserved his strength during long climbs, how he reacted when something went wrong, not catastrophically but inconveniently, because in the mountains it was the accumulation of minor mistakes, not one enormous one, that quietly claimed the unprepared. Humility meant accepting that he could not control the land or command the weather. No skill, no experience, no stubbornness could bend the mountains to his will. He learned to bow to circumstances rather than fight them, to shelter instead of push forward when the sky darkened too quickly, to yield to the storm rather than challenge it, understanding that the wilderness rewarded patience and punished defiance with equal indifference. He also learned that being humble meant knowing when his own body whispered for rest, for warmth, for food, recognizing that ignoring discomfort out of pride only invited danger, because the cold was always waiting for that one lapse, that moment when he moved too quickly or pushed too far, or chose confidence over caution. And in that instant the mountains would remind him that respect was not optional. The old trappers he had learned from never spoke about bravery. They spoke about awareness, about paying attention, about staying small within the vast unfeeling world, because they understood better than anyone that the men who died in the mountains were not the weakest but often the proudest, the ones who believed they were immune to winter's quiet patience. Humility, he realized, was not weakness but wisdom, a way of moving through the world that allowed him to survive where others faltered. He found humility in the simple tasks, chopping wood with slow, careful strokes instead of trying to prove strength, building shelters low and compact instead of grand and exposed, rationing food not with fear but with discipline, lighting fires with the patience of a man who knows each spark is a privilege, not a guarantee. He discovered humility in the way he watched animals move more gracefully through the snow than he ever could, admitting to himself that they understood this land more deeply than any man ever would. Even the act of walking became an expression of humility. His steps grew quieter, smaller, more deliberate, as though he were trying not to disturb the world around him, and in doing so he felt the land open to him in ways it never had before, not welcoming but permitting, allowing him to pass through without challenge. Humility softened him without weakening him, teaching him to take the world as it was rather than how he wished it to be. And in that acceptance he found a strange peace, a calmness that settled in his chest like a low-burning coal, warm and steady, reminding him that survival was not about conquering the cold but coexisting with it. And so, each evening, as he sat beside his fire and watched the shadows flicker across the snow, he felt that quiet understanding settled deeper into him, that the mountains owed him nothing, that the cold made no promises, and that each day he survived was not a triumph over nature, but a small, grateful moment of harmony with it. One man breathing gently in a place far larger and older than anything he could ever claim to understand. As winter pressed deeper into the land and the world around him grew quieter in ways that felt almost ancient, the mountain man began to understand that isolation in the wilderness was not a punishment but a slow rearranging of the senses, a gentle stripping away of everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. Breath, warmth, movement, awareness, each one suddenly brighter, sharper, more meaningful, in a place where distractions vanished under the snow, and only truth was left behind. At first the solitude had frightened him, not because he feared being alone, but because he feared what he might hear in the silence, his own thoughts echoing too loudly, regrets drifting back, like distant voices in the wind. But over time he discovered that the mountains had a way of quieting the inner noise, just as surely as they muted the outer world, until even his thoughts began to move slower, softer, as though respecting the hush that lay across the land. In long stretches of stillness, he noticed how solitude reshaped time itself. Hours did not hurry the way they did in towns or camps. They drifted like falling snow, each one landing lightly, dissolving into the next, and he found himself living not by clocks or schedules, but by the subtle rhythms of the day, the angle of the sun, the deepening shade in the valleys, the way the temperature changed when the sky shifted from pale blue to the heavy grey of coming storms. He found companionship not in noise but in small, intimate details, the soft groan of trees bending under frost, the distant call of a raven drifting through the cold air, the quiet crackle of a fire struggling against wind, the steady, reassuring sound of his own breath, rising like a thin ghost in the frigid morning. These sounds became a kind of company, not lively or warm but honest, offering him the comfort of consistency in a world where change was slow and subtle. Loneliness, he discovered, was not the absence of people but the absence of purpose, and out here he had purpose in abundance, each movement deliberate, each task grounding him to the world in a way that everyday life never had. Gathering wood, melting snow for water, checking traps, repairing gear, choosing the right path through the deepening drifts, all these simple actions gave shape to his days, anchoring him to the landscape, like roots anchoring a tree. He learned that solitude could become a kind of mirror, reflecting not grand revelations but the quiet truths he had carried all along, the stubbornness that kept him moving when tired, the fear that whispered softly at night, the resilience he didn't fully know he possessed, the patience that winter demanded from every living thing that dared to stay. Sometimes, as he walked through the blue dusk of late afternoon, surrounded by nothing but snow and the long shadows of the pines, he felt a strange sense of belonging, not to the land itself but to the silence that lived here, a silence that accepted him without question or judgment, a silence vast enough to swallow worry, and tender enough to make even the simplest moments, lifting a cup of warm broth, adjusting the fur on his shoulders, watching sparks drift into the night, feel profound. Over time, solitude stopped being an emptiness and became a space, a quiet clearing inside himself where he could breathe without hurry, without expectation, without the noise of the world pressing against his thoughts. The mountains did not comfort him, but they steadied him, and in their steadiness he found something he had not felt in years, a calm that asked for nothing and offered nothing in return, except the simple truth of being alive in a place that demanded awareness, humility, and a quiet heart. And so, night after night, as he lay wrapped in furs listening to the wind hum through the trees, he came to embrace solitude not as a companion or an escape, but as a teacher, one that spoke slowly, patiently, in lessons formed from frost, firelight, and silence, reminding him that sometimes the greatest strength a man could carry was the ability to sit quietly with himself in the long frozen dark. As the weeks folded into one another, and the cold settled into its deep, unshakable rhythm, the mountain man began to understand that endurance in the wilderness was never a single act of bravery, but a long chain of small decisions, each one linking quietly to the next, forming a kind of fragile armor against the cold, an armor built not of metal or muscle but of patience, routine, and an acceptance that life here moved according to winter's slow and unbending pace. He learned that the body adjusted long before the mind ever admitted it. Fingers that once stung with every icy breeze began to move more surely. Breath that once burned in his lungs found a slower, steadier rhythm. Muscles that had tensed against the cold without permission now relaxed into its presence as though becoming part of it. The transformation was not dramatic, not something he noticed in a single moment, but rather something that revealed itself gradually, like frost forming on a window pane, delicate and inevitable. Each morning when he stepped out into the pale light, he felt his body settling into a new understanding of survival, no longer flinching at the cold but absorbing it, accepting it, adapting to it in ways the mountain men of old had always known were possible. He found himself breathing differently, slower and deeper, conserving warmth the way a tight-knit shelter conserved smoke. He walked with a measured rhythm, placing each step carefully to avoid sinking too deeply into the drifts, and he carried his weight in a way that kept his energy from bleeding into the cold air around him. Pain, once sharp and distracting, faded into a kind of quiet companion, something he acknowledged but no longer feared. A stiff joint, a frozen fingertip, a wind-burned cheek, these became simple facts rather than warnings, small tolls paid for existing in a landscape that did not soften for any living thing. What once had felt unbearable now slipped into the background, absorbed by the strange calm that settled over him whenever he worked with purpose in the biting air. He realized that survival here meant letting the body do its work without interference, trusting it the way he trusted fire to burn when given the right fuel. The body remembered things the mind tried to forget: how to warm itself slowly, how to conserve movement, how to rest without collapsing into stillness, long enough for cold to creep into the bones. And in time he found a rhythm that surprised him, a rhythm where discomfort stopped feeling like suffering and instead became simply part of the landscape, like the snow or the silent trees or the endless, low-humming wind. There was something strangely peaceful about this shift, as though a door had quietly opened inside him, leading into a place where endurance meant more than resisting hardship. It meant adapting so thoroughly that the hardship itself lost its edge, dulled by familiarity. It wasn't that the cold grew gentler. It never did. It was that he grew more fluent in its language, understanding not just how to survive it, but how to live within it, without constant tension, without the gnawing fear that had once sat at the back of his mind, like a restless animal. Some nights, As he sat near his fire watching the flames wobble in the wind, he would feel a strange kinship with the men who had walked these mountains long before him, those half-wild trappers whose stories he'd heard in whispers and whose endurance had seemed impossible once. Now he understood them not as legends or fools, but as men who had simply given their bodies the time to learn what the cold demanded: patience, steadiness, and the quiet willingness to let winter reshape them without breaking them. And in those moments, with the fire warming one side of his face and the cold brushing the other, he realized that endurance was not strength forced upon the world, but strength found in its acceptance, an understanding that surviving the cold meant not fighting it, but allowing it to become part of you for a little while, long enough to see morning light again. As the winter wore on, and the world around him settled into deeper layers of silence, the mountain man discovered that pain in the wilderness was not a signal to stop, but a reminder to notice, a constant whisper tugging at the edges of his awareness, teaching him that in a place ruled by frost and distance, discomfort was not an interruption to survival, but an inseparable part of it, threaded into every movement, every breath, every decision made beneath the slow-moving sky. Pain came in small, sharp moments: a fingertip that burned before going numb, a muscle that tightened after too many miles in the snow, the sting of wind carving across his face like the edge of a cold blade, and he realized quickly that if he paid attention to each spark of discomfort, he could understand what his body needed long before danger took hold. The wilderness did not give second chances. Ignoring pain meant letting the cold write its own ending. So he learned to read his body the way he read the land, treating every ache like a signpost. A throbbing in his feet meant he needed dry socks immediately, no matter how tired he was. A tightening in his back meant he'd carried too much weight for too long and needed to shift the load before strain turned into injury. A dull ache in his hands meant it was time to stop and warm them over the fire, not out of luxury but necessity, because the cold always waited patiently for the moment he pushed himself one step too far. Pain became a kind of internal weather report, a forecast that helped him navigate not just the landscape around him, but the landscape within. Where modern life taught people to avoid discomfort at all costs, the mountains taught him to interpret it, quietly, calmly, without panic, because understanding the small stings kept him from encountering the catastrophic ones. He found, too, that pain in the wilderness had its own strange rhythm. The first moments of morning always hurt the most. The shock of cold air against warm skin, the stiffness in joints not fully awake. But once he began to move, once his muscles remembered their purpose, the pain seemed to soften, settling into the background like a low hum that oddly steadied him. There was comfort in that constancy, in knowing that as long as he felt the ache, his body was still speaking to him, still fighting, still alive. Sometimes, as he trudged through deep drifts with the wind at his back, he realized that the cold used pain the way a teacher uses a ruler, not to punish, but to direct. It reminded him when he was moving too fast or too slow, when he was growing careless, when exhaustion was starting to cloud his thoughts. It kept him alert in moments when complacency might have crept in, sharpening his senses the way flint sharpens steel. At night, when he lay wrapped in furs listening to the crackle of the fire, he felt the ache settle into a quiet throb beneath his skin, and though it was unpleasant, it never frightened him anymore. Pain meant blood still moved, nerves still answered, life still flickered inside him, even as the world outside froze in layers of silence. It reminded him that he had made it through another day of winter, a victory not measured by ease but by endurance. In the strange calculus of the mountains, pain was not the enemy but a companion, sometimes unwelcome but always honest, and he learned to greet it with the same calm he offered the cold wind or the long shadow of night. The wilderness, he realized, gave few comforts, but one of them was the clarity that pain brought, the understanding that he was still present, still capable, still fighting quietly for each hour of warmth and breath. And so he carried his aches without resentment, letting them fold into him as naturally as the cold itself, knowing that each small throb was another quiet thread stitching him into this frozen world, a world that offered nothing gently but everything truthfully. As the long winter continued to press itself against the mountains with that slow, immovable certainty that felt almost geological, the mountain man began to understand that solitude, pain, cold, hunger, and endurance were not separate trials but threads of the same fabric, woven tightly together into a life that demanded his full attention. And in that constant vigilance he discovered a strange clarity, the kind that arrives only when a man has been stripped of everything unnecessary and left alone with the raw pulse of existence beating steady beneath his ribs. He realized that every moment in the wilderness carried a weight that daily life elsewhere could never match. The simple act of waking required a quiet assessment of his limbs, feeling for stiffness or numbness, making sure the cold had not stolen anything essential in the night. And then, as he crawled from beneath his furs, he listened not for alarms or voices, but for the deeper rhythms of the land, the way the wind moved through the pines, the faint settling of snow on branches, the distant crack that might be a shifting ice shelf, or the first warning of a storm preparing to tighten its grip around the valley. Even the smallest tasks of the day stretched themselves into long, careful rituals. Gathering wood became a journey of judgment, strength, and awareness, as he scanned the snow-dusted forest for branches dry enough to burn, knowing that wet wood stole heat and time was its own currency in a world where daylight felt fragile and easily spent. Melting snow for water required patience, tending the pot slowly enough to avoid scorching it, stirring gently to distribute warmth, so the process wouldn't stall into slush, and maintaining his fire demanded constant negotiation with the wind, which could turn a steady flame into drifting smoke at the slightest shift, as though reminding him that warmth was never to be taken for granted. His hunger, too, carried a different meaning out here. It wasn't something to cure, but something to understand, a quiet reminder of how thin the line was between comfort and desperation, and he learned to listen to the subtle signals his body gave. The slow drain of energy in his legs during a long climb, the tightening of his stomach when hours passed without food, the strange clarity that came when he rationed carefully, eating just enough to keep his strength without letting want cloud his judgment, or drive him into reckless decisions that the cold would punish immediately. Often, as he walked along traplines buried beneath layers of frost, he felt the cold creeping up through his boots, threading itself through his bones with a quiet confidence that made him acutely aware of every misstep, because the cold did not rush or chase. It simply waited with the kind of patience only nature possesses, knowing that a single mistake, a soaked glove, a torn boot, a fire that failed to catch, was enough to unravel hours of careful preparation and leave him staring into a night that cared nothing for his fear. Yet in all this he noticed how the wilderness taught him not through cruelty but through consistency, offering the same lesson each day in slightly different forms. Move slowly, think clearly, listen closely, respect everything around you, for the mountains owed no man a single sunrise and gave nothing freely except silence. And as he moved through that silence, the world around him seemed to grow both larger and more intimate. He could stand in a clearing where the snow spread out like a blank page, the sky a pale wash of color, the trees rising like dark columns into the cold air, and in that vast stillness he felt himself reduced to something small and transient, yet strangely anchored by the knowledge that even fleeting life had weight here, that his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air was a reminder of the fragile line that separated waking from not waking, warmth from cold, presence from absence. The mountains did not bend, did not soften, did not change for him, but in their immovable presence he found a rhythm that soothed him more than any comfort ever had. The long days spent walking, gathering, mending, watching the sky, tending the fire, and listening to the quiet pulse of the land became a kind of meditative cycle, each task folding into the next, with no separation, creating a life that was not split into hours or obligations, but lived as one unbroken sentence of awareness, breath, and effort. As the deep winter landscape continued to stretch around him, In an unbroken expanse of white and shadow, the mountain man began to recognize that survival in the wilderness was not measured in grand victories or dramatic feats, but in the quiet, almost invisible choices he made hour by hour, choices that threaded themselves through the long days and longer nights, like thin roots anchoring him to life, choices so small that any one of them could be dismissed in a moment of carelessness. Yet together they formed the difference between waking to another sunrise and never waking at all. He understood that the cold, for all its indifference and silence, possessed a strange honesty that civilization rarely offered, because winter never pretended to be anything other than what it was. It did not flatter, did not deceive, did not console. It simply existed with a clarity that shaped every breath he took, every step through the snow, every movement of his hands as he coaxed sparks from flint, or adjusted the layers wrapped around his body, and in that simplicity he found a truth more grounding than any comfort he had ever known in warmer, easier places. There were moments walking through the dense stillness of early morning when the sky was a pale, frost-bitten blue, and the air felt as sharp as broken glass, that he felt as though the world itself were holding its breath, listening to the faint crunch of his footsteps and the slow exhale of his breath drifting upward like smoke, and in those moments he sensed the quiet, ancient rhythm of the land moving beneath everything, a rhythm that cared nothing for his presence but allowed him, briefly and without acknowledgement, to exist within it. As he travelled through forests where the trees stood tall and unmoving under the weight of ice, he found himself observing the way frost formed delicate patterns on the bark, each one unique and intricate as though sculpted by an unseen hand, and he realized that even here, in a world that demanded so much from him, there were moments of quiet beauty woven into the fabric of survival, moments that reminded him that harshness and grace could live side by side without contradiction. Even his exhaustion took on a different shape in the mountains. It was not the restless fatigue of crowded places or noisy days, but a slow, natural weariness that settled into his bones like a soft weight, reminding him that his body had worked honestly, had moved through the cold with purpose, and now required rest, not as indulgence but as simple necessity, much like the earth required darkness before dawn. He found that when he stopped to rest, leaning against a fallen log or crouching beside a frozen creek to drink water, melted carefully over his fire, his mind began to drift in long, unhurried currents, thinking not of the past or the future, but of the present moment in its entirety, as though winter had stripped time itself into something cleaner, quieter, and infinitely more manageable than the tangled hours he remembered from the world beyond the mountains. Sometimes, during these pauses, he noticed how the land seemed to speak in subtle cues, a sudden gust of wind that carried the unmistakable scent of snow, a distant crack that signaled shifting ice, the nervous flutter of birds fleeing ahead of a storm, and he understood that the wilderness was not silent at all, but speaking in a language that required stillness to hear, a language he was slowly learning word by word, gesture by gesture. He began to sense storms before they arrived, recognizing how the air grew heavier, how the horizon dimmed as though the sky were inhaling deeply before exhaling a curtain of white, how the very texture of the snow underfoot changed from crisp to muffled, almost as though the land itself were bracing for the weight of what was coming. And in those moments he never hesitated. He gathered wood, checked his shelter, strengthened his fire pit, and prepared for the long night ahead, knowing that readiness was not fear but respect, a respect earned through days spent listening to what the world whispered rather than what he wished to hear. In the evenings, as the fire cracked softly beside him and sent ribbons of warm light flickering through the dark, he felt a growing sense of becoming part of the cycle of cold and warmth, of silence and effort, of stillness and movement, until the wilderness no longer felt foreign or hostile but simply vast, ancient and deeply honest, a place that shaped him not by breaking him but by revealing the quiet strengths he carried without realizing it. As the cold continued its slow, unwavering seep into every corner of the mountains, the mountain man found himself growing into a version of himself he had never expected to meet. A man shaped not by ambition or pride, but by the steady, patient weight of winter. And he came to understand that living through the long freeze required a certain surrender, not a surrender of will, but of illusions, those fragile beliefs that a person could command the world rather than move gently within it. He realized that the wilderness did not reward boldness the way society often did. Here the loud, the reckless, the hurried were swallowed quickly and without fanfare, their stories ending not in drama but in quiet, snow-covered finality, while those who survived longest were the ones who knew how to slow themselves to the rhythm of the land, to match their breath to the wind, to lower their expectations until each small success felt like a kind of quiet miracle. There was a profound stillness in these long days, a stillness that stretched across the landscape like a vast white sheet, smoothing every shape into soft curves and muted shadows. And in that stillness he began to find a new kind of wisdom, a wisdom not tied to thought but to presence, the simple awareness of existing moment by moment without the need to hurry, justify, or escape. It was in this slow awareness that he started to understand the mountain men of old, not as hardened legends but as men who had learned to live inside the pauses of the world, trusting that even silence had something to teach, if you stayed long enough to listen. On some mornings when he stepped out into the thin winter light, he felt the cold pressing gently but insistently against him, not as an enemy but as a reminder that nothing here could be rushed. Even the sky seemed to move slower, clouds drifting lazily across the pale horizon, carrying with them the unspoken promise of snow that might come soon or might come hours later, but would certainly come. And he moved in response, not with urgency but with deliberation, each task unfolding in a long, unbroken line. Gather wood, melt snow, check traps, repair gear, return to camp, all carried out with a kind of measured patience that felt almost like a form of prayer. He noticed how the cold sharpened his senses, not in a frantic way but in a calm, focused one. He could smell an oncoming freeze in the metallic tang of the air, hear the subtle groan of trees shifting under ice, feel the temperature drop in the thin skin beneath his eyes, long before he saw the first drifting flakes. These small signals, once invisible to him, now guided his decisions with the precision of a compass, reminding him that the wilderness communicated constantly, but only to those willing to hear its quiet voice. Hunger, too, became something different, not a complaint, not an inconvenience, but a quiet companion that reminded him to remain aware of his body's needs, to balance effort and rest with the kind of careful attention rarely practiced in easier places. Food was no longer a comfort or indulgence but fuel, and each bite carried the warm gratitude of knowing it would become heat and movement and breath, carrying him one more hour through the cold. Even his fire came to feel like something more than warmth. Its crackling voice in the night became a kind of anchor, a soft reminder that life persisted even in a world made of ice and silence. He sat beside it for long stretches, watching sparks lift into the dark, each one a small, bright defiance against the enormity of winter, and he found himself breathing slower, thinking less, letting the steady glow settle into him like a heartbeat outside his own. And in these quiet hours when the world narrowed to firelight and cold air, and the slow drift of thought softened by fatigue, he sensed a gentle truth forming inside him, that the wilderness did not change men by force but by invitation, offering them a chance to shed the rush and noise of ordinary life and step into a slower, more honest existence where each moment, no matter how small, carried its own quiet weight. As the heart of winter settled into its deepest calm, and the days became little more than pale glimmers between long stretches of night, the mountain man found himself slipping into a rhythm so quiet and steady that it no longer felt like survival but like inhabiting a different kind of time, a time unmeasured by clocks or calendars, marked instead by the slow rise of smoke from his fire, the crisp sound of snow underfoot, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the cold that revealed more about the world than any words ever could. He realized that the wilderness, in its vast indifference, had begun to reshape his thoughts, smoothing the sharp edges of worry, dulling the frantic pace of memory, and slowing the restless thrum of his mind, until each idea drifted softly, like snowflakes falling through still air, no longer weighed down by urgency or expectation, but simply appearing and dissolving in their own time. It was not that he stopped thinking, but rather that his thoughts lost their grip on him. They wandered like distant clouds across the wide winter sky, observed gently and without judgment. There were long afternoons when he would pause in the middle of a task, splitting wood, melting snow, mending a torn strap, and find himself simply watching the landscape, not searching for danger or planning his next move, but witnessing the quiet majesty of a world stripped down to its essentials. The snow spread unbroken across the valley. The trees stood tall and silent beneath their burden of ice, and the mountains rose in the distance like ancient guardians keeping their quiet watch. And in that vast, unmoving scene he felt an unexpected sense of belonging, as though for the first time his presence did not interrupt the world but moved in harmony with it. He began to understand that solitude was not an emptiness, but a vast, open space inside himself, where thoughts could settle without pressure, where feelings could surface without noise, where the simple act of breathing could feel like a kind of slow, deliberate conversation with the land around him. In that space he felt a gentleness he had not known in many years, the kind that blooms only when there is nothing left to perform for, nothing left to prove, nothing left to chase but the next glow of firelight or the next drift of snow sliding softly from a branch. There were nights when he lay wrapped in furs, listening to the long, low sigh of the wind moving between the trees, and he felt as though the world were speaking in a language too old and quiet for most men to hear. It was not a voice of comfort or warmth, but neither was it cruel. It was steady, ancient, patient, a reminder that life continued long before him, and would continue long after, and that his time in this place, brief as it was, carried its own small truth simply by being lived fully in the present moment. Even his fire, that small circle of warmth against the enormous cold, began to feel like a companion in a way more profound than he had expected. He watched the flames dance, watched them falter, watched them rise again with each breath of wind, and he sensed that tending the fire was more than a necessity. It was a ritual of care, a quiet affirmation that even in the harshest season, warmth could be coaxed into existence and guarded through the night with patience and attention. He found himself speaking softly to the flames, sometimes not out of loneliness but out of familiarity, thanking them for their heat, asking them for a little more time, as if acknowledging that in the great balance of cold and survival, they were partners in the same fragile endeavor. And in those moments when the firelight flickered across the snow and cast long shadows that stretched into the dark, he felt a deep, settling peace, a peace not born of comfort but of acceptance, the understanding that he had become part of the winter rather than an intruder fighting against it. He had learned its rhythms, its signals, its moods, and in return the cold had taught him a truth he could not have found anywhere else. That strength was not the absence of struggle, but the quiet persistence with which he met each day, each task, each breath, trusting that, as long as he moved with patience and awareness, the mountains would allow him to endure. As winter settled even further into its deep and unbroken stillness, the mountain man began to recognize that life in the wilderness was not simply a matter of enduring hardship, but of understanding the quiet exchanges that shaped each day, the subtle negotiations between body and cold, hunger and effort, fire and wind. And he realized that these exchanges, though silent and often unseen, formed the true backbone of survival, weaving themselves into his thoughts and movements until he no longer questioned them, but followed their rhythm as naturally as he breathed. He found that every morning began not with urgency but with contemplation. Lying beneath his furs for a moment, as the pale light seeped through the cracks of his shelter, listening for the faint cues that marked the state of the world outside. The soft patter of loose snow slipping from branches, the muted whistle of wind curling around the rocks, the absence or presence of animal tracks near his camp, each sound or silence telling him something about the day ahead before he even lifted his head. And when he finally rose, he did so slowly, stretching stiff limbs with the careful respect winter demanded, knowing that rushing brought mistakes, and mistakes brought consequences. The cold would claim without hesitation. As he worked through the tasks of the morning, he noticed how the cold carved everything into sharper focus. The bite of frost against his fingertips, the crisp snap of kindling beneath his gloves, the faint shimmer of ice on his breath, all of it reminded him to be present, attentive, patient. There was something strangely grounding in this constant awareness, as though each sensation anchored him more deeply into the moment, pulling him away from the scattered thoughts and distant concerns that had once filled his mind in warmer, easier times. Even the simple act of walking through the forest became a slow unfolding of observation. He felt the give of the snow beneath his boots, learned to distinguish the subtle differences between deep powder and hardened crust, understood that each step carried a message about the land's mood, and that listening to those messages kept him from sinking or slipping or straining his strength in ways that would come back to haunt him later. The forest itself seemed to change as he grew more attuned to it. What once felt vast and cold now revealed its hidden patterns, its quiet signs of life, its careful rhythms of movement and stillness. He could sense when a storm was hours away simply by the way the branches held their weight, heavy with unshed snow. He could tell if an animal had passed recently by the faint warmth left in its tracks. He could feel shifts in the air that signaled a change in temperature long before the first cloud drifted over the sun. These small bits of knowledge, gathered slowly and without fanfare, began to guide him more than any memory or plan, creating a kind of intuitive map inside him that adapted with each day, each hour. There were times as he gathered wood or repaired a torn seam on his clothing, when he felt an unexpected calm wash over him, not the excitement of achievement or the relief of safety, but a deeper, quieter understanding that in this place, effort mattered more than outcome, that doing each task with patience and care was its own reward, even if the cold erased the evidence by evening. He learned that perfection had no place here. Only consistency mattered, the steady repetition of small acts that collectively shaped the course of his survival. And in the long evenings when the darkness arrived early and spread itself across the sky like a great heavy blanket, he found a strange comfort in the flickering glow of his fire, watching the flames twist and settle with the same slow grace as snow falling outside his shelter. The fire's warmth felt less like luxury now, and more like dialogue, a quiet exchange between him and the wilderness, the fire offering light and heat, and he offering vigilance and gratitude, knowing that its survival depended as much on his attention as his survival depended on its glow. As he sat with his back against a log or tucked beneath his furs, listening to the fire whisper and the wind sigh in the distance, he realized that the wilderness had taught him something he had never expected to learn, that strength was not found in force or defiance, but in the quiet willingness to remain patient, to observe, to adapt, to let the cold shape him without breaking him, to move gently through a world that asked nothing of him except respect. As the long winter deepened into a kind of quiet eternity, and the mountains settled into their heavier stillness, the mountain man began to recognize that survival was not simply the sum of his actions, but the slow transformation of his inner landscape, because the wilderness had a way of peeling back the layers of a man's thoughts until only the fundamental truths remained: breath, warmth, purpose, and the gentle acceptance that life out here was not something to conquer, but something to inhabit with humility and patience. He found himself noticing how the cold taught lessons without ever raising its voice. Each morning, when he stepped out into the pale, silver-blue light and felt the air tighten around him, he understood that winter was always teaching, not through sudden shocks or dramatic storms, but through small, persistent reminders. A stiff joint, a brittle branch, a gust of wind colder than the one before, and in those moments he felt himself adjusting, not in rebellion but in harmony, shifting his pace, his posture, his breath, until his body and the land moved almost in unison. During long walks across the frozen hills, he began to sense how his thoughts stretched out like the horizon, no longer tangled or impatient but drifting in slow, steady waves. As though the cold itself had smoothed the edges of his mind, memories rose without their usual weight, worries dissolved before fully forming, and instead of dwelling on the past or anticipating the future, he found himself returning again and again to the quiet simplicity of the present. The crunch of snow underfoot, the faint warmth of sunlight on his cheek, the soft exhale of breath that crystallized briefly before vanishing into the air. He realized that the wilderness had taken away the noise he once relied on, not just the literal noise of towns and voices, but the internal noise, the restless chatter of thoughts and expectations that followed him everywhere before he came here. And in its place, winter offered him something far rarer, a spaciousness of mind that felt almost like peace, though a rugged, unvarnished kind of peace, that insisted he ask nothing more of the world than what it already gave. His movements grew slower but more precise, his hands steadier even in the cold, his eyes more attentive to the smallest shifts in light and shadow. He could feel when the snow beneath his boots thinned just slightly, warning him of hidden hollows. He could hear the faint tension in tree branches that signaled the weight of ice about to crack. He could sense when the air grew too still, the kind of stillness that always preceded snow, not by minutes but by hours. These skills did not arrive as revelations but as quiet accumulations, learned by repetition, by attention, by the simple willingness to be present with the world rather than rush through it. He understood now why the mountain men who came before him seemed almost mythical in their resilience. They had not been superhuman, they had merely learned how to listen, how to see, how to feel the land's subtle warnings before they hardened into consequences. In the evenings, when the sky deepened into the dark indigo of a winter night and the first stars began to appear with a crispness he had never witnessed in warmer seasons, he sat by his fire and watched the flames dance while the wind curled lazily around the edges of his camp, carrying with it the low hum of the forest settling into sleep. These hours, once filled with the anxiety of darkness and cold, had become moments of reflection, where he felt the vastness of the world not as a threat but as an invitation to quiet himself, to breathe deeply, to let the steady glow of the fire soften the edges of exhaustion, and remind him that rest too was part of survival. And as he lay beneath his furs, listening to the slow rhythm of the night, he sensed that winter had given him something he had spent much of his life searching for without knowing its name, a sense of belonging not tied to place or people, but to the simple awareness of being part of a world larger than himself, a world that asked little and offered less, yet somehow gave him a depth of presence he had never felt before. As the winter reached a depth so complete that even time seemed to slow beneath its weight, the mountain man began to notice how the cold revealed truths that warmth had always managed to hide, because in the silence and stillness of the frozen world there was no place for distraction or denial, only the quiet honesty of living moment to moment, each breath a small confirmation that he still belonged to the land, and the land, indifferent yet consistent, still allowed him to remain. He realized that hardship in the wilderness did not come in dramatic bursts, but in the gentle accumulation of small challenges, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. The numbness in his fingertips after a long walk, the dull ache in his shoulders from chopping wood, the slight tightening in his boots as snow melted and refroze, but together they formed a constant test of his awareness, reminding him that survival was not about outlasting the cold, but adapting to its every mood, adjusting himself with patience and humility rather than force or frustration. There were mornings when he stepped outside and felt the cold press against him like a wall, the kind of cold that seemed to settle inside his lungs and echo through his ribs. And on those mornings he moved more slowly, more deliberately, treating each action not as an obstacle but as part of an unspoken ritual. Collecting wood, checking his traps, melting snow into water, watching the horizon for changes in color or texture that hinted at storms, knowing that every careful preparation was a quiet act of respect for the land's unpredictable nature. As days passed, the wilderness taught him that endurance was less about strength and more about honesty. The honesty to admit fatigue before it became danger. The honesty to rest when his body asked before it demanded. The honesty to accept that even the smallest comfort, like a cup of warm broth or a moment near the fire, carried its own kind of salvation in a place where warmth was no small gift. He found himself reflecting on how rarely, in his earlier life, he had allowed slowness to shape his days. There had always been noise, urgency, demands from the world that made stillness feel like wasted time, but here, in the long quiet of winter, stillness had become a teacher, guiding his thoughts into a calm he had never learned to trust before. He noticed how the cold encouraged humility, how it forced him to bow his head against the wind, to kneel beside the fire to coax it back to life, to bend low to study tracks in the snow, each gesture reminding him that survival was not about dominance, but about cooperation with forces greater and older than himself. There were afternoons when he stopped in the middle of a trail and simply stood in the silence, feeling the cold seep into his clothes, while his breath rose in steady white plumes, and in those moments he sensed how profoundly the wilderness had changed him. His heartbeat slowed, his thoughts quieted, and he felt a deep connection to the world around him, not as something owned or overcome, but as something participated in, a vast and ancient presence that permitted him a place within its frozen boundaries. Even the twilight, once a time of worry, now felt like a companion, its long shadows stretching gently across the snow, wrapping the land in a blue-grey hush that made each crackle of his fire seem louder, each flicker of flame brighter, and he found a strange comfort in watching the light shift across the mountainsides, knowing that this cycle of day fading into night had repeated itself for centuries with no need for witness or acknowledgement. At night, when he lay wrapped in furs and listened to the faint groan of trees under the weight of ice, he felt a quiet gratitude settle over him, not the loud, exuberant gratitude of triumph or success, but a softer, steadier kind, the kind that grows from simply surviving another day, from feeling the warmth of the fire on his skin and the cold at his back, and knowing that both were necessary, both were part of the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. And in that soft balance between cold and warmth, silence and breath, effort and rest, he understood something that would stay with him long after winter released its grip, that the wilderness did not demand greatness from him, only presence. It asked not for heroism but for attention, not for perfection but for patience, and in giving those things freely, he found a peace deeper than anything comfort had ever provided. As the season continued its slow drift toward its coldest, most unforgiving heart, the mountain man began to feel as though the wilderness was shaping him from the inside out, sanding down the rough edges of his former life, and replacing them with a kind of patient resilience that did not announce itself with bravado or force, but with the steady, unhurried understanding that every moment spent in the cold carried meaning, simply because he had endured it. He noticed how his senses grew sharper in ways he had never expected, not in sudden bursts of alertness, but in the gradual fine-tuning that came from long exposure to silence and stillness. He could feel temperature changes not just on his skin but in the air around him, in the way his breath formed smaller or larger clouds, in the faint shift of pressure against his ears. He recognized the difference between the soft whisper of powder snow and the brittle snap of ice crystals, and he knew that each held a different warning, each demanded a different response. Even his footsteps carried a new intention. Where once he walked quickly, impatiently, he now stepped lightly and deliberately, not because he feared the cold, but because he had learned to move with it instead of against it, matching his pace to the terrain, listening for the subtle creaks and groans of the land beneath the snow, sensing when the earth was solid and when it was hollowed by unseen drifts. This careful, rhythmic movement gave him a strange feeling of belonging, as if the land acknowledged his presence not as an intruder, but as a quiet traveller passing respectfully through its frozen domain. The cold, which had once felt like an adversary pressing constantly against him, now felt more like a stern teacher whose lessons were delivered with calm consistency. It showed him where he had failed to tie a knot tightly enough, where he had underestimated the hunger waiting in his own body, where he had pushed too far without resting. And though these lessons were sometimes brutal, they were never spiteful. They were simply reminders that the wilderness offered no shortcuts, no indulgences, no forgiveness for carelessness. As he tended his fire each night, feeding it slowly with small dry twigs before adding the larger branches that would carry it through the long hours of darkness, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him, the satisfaction of work done not for reward or praise, but for the simple, steady continuation of life. The fire's glow lit the walls of his shelter with a warm, flickering light, turning even the harshest nights into something gentle for a few precious hours, and as he watched the flames lick upward, bending and straightening with each curl of wind, he realized that he had begun to measure time, not in minutes or hours, but in the life of the fire itself, in the slow transformation of wood into heat, in the soft collapse of embers turning to ash. Sometimes, as he sat beside that fire and listened to the endless quiet of the forest, he felt a deep, surprising gratitude, not for comfort, because there was little of that, but for clarity. The wilderness had stripped his days down to their essential parts, revealing what truly mattered: warmth, food, rest, awareness, breath. And in the absence of noise and rush and expectation, those simple needs felt almost sacred, grounding him more deeply than anything he had known before, reminding him that life, even when reduced to its barest form, carried a profound fullness that could be felt only in the silence of winter. And when he finally lay down for the night, wrapped in furs that smelled faintly of smoke and pine, feeling the cold press gently through the gaps but not deeply enough to harm him, he understood that survival was no longer just a physical act but a state of mind, one that required not only strength and endurance, but a calm willingness to meet the world exactly as it was, without resistance, without fear, with nothing but attention and breath. As the frozen weeks unfolded into something that felt almost outside the boundaries of ordinary life, the mountain man began to sense that winter was not merely a season he was enduring, but a vast, wordless presence shaping the pace of his thoughts and the rhythm of his days. Because the longer he lived in that immense silence, the more he understood that the cold had its own kind of wisdom, one that asked nothing from him except attentiveness, and rewarded him only with the quiet permission to keep going. He noticed that his world had become smaller in its physical demands, yet infinitely larger in its depth, because every action, pulling on his boots, tightening the straps on his pack, coaxing a flame from cold flint, walking across the crusted snow, held a kind of weight and significance that had been lost to him in the noise of the life he once knew. Tasks that had once felt trivial now carried a subtle solemnity, not because they were difficult, but because they were necessary, and necessity had a way of clarifying what mattered. There were mornings when he stepped outside and felt the world holding itself in a perfect, breathless pause, the kind of silence so complete that even his heartbeat felt too loud, and in that stillness he sensed the deep, ancient continuity of the land, how the trees had endured centuries of winters like this one, how the mountains had seen men come and go like passing shadows, how the snow itself seemed to carry memories older than anything he could imagine. Standing in that silence, he understood how small he truly was, yet he did not feel diminished. Instead, he felt folded gently into something greater, as though the cold air wrapping itself around him was not rejection but acknowledgement. Even the hardships had begun to change their meaning. The sting of icy wind against his face no longer felt like resistance but like a reminder to stay awake, to stay aware. The ache in his muscles after a long day of gathering wood felt less like exhaustion and more like proof that his body still carried the strength to continue. The hunger that gnawed quietly at him between meals was not suffering but a signal, a message from within that connected him to the very pulse of survival. He found himself reflecting often in these quiet moments, not about the life he'd left behind, but about the unexpected clarity that winter had given him, that comfort had never taught him anything, and ease had never revealed any truth worth keeping. Here, where the days moved slowly and every sensation felt honest, he discovered that the world asked only one question of him: "Are you paying attention?" And for the first time in his life, he felt the answer was yes. As twilight gathered over the land and the snow took on its familiar blue hue, he moved through his evening routine with the same slow ritual he had grown into over the long weeks, gathering the last bits of wood, checking the shelter's edges, kneeling by the fire to breathe life into its fading embers. Each action felt like part of an unspoken pact between him and the wilderness. He would give the land his effort, his humility, his care, and in return the land would give him enough warmth to survive the night. Sometimes he found himself simply sitting beside the fire long after his tasks were done, watching the flames cast trembling shadows on the snow, and feeling a strange, soft peace drift through him. Peace not from comfort, but from acceptance, the kind that settles when a man stops demanding anything more from the world than what it naturally offers. And when he finally crawled beneath his furs, letting the cold brush lightly against him while the faint warmth of the fire clung to the air, he realized that winter had taught him something few people ever learned, that survival is not a battle to be won, but a conversation, a long, quiet exchange between man and nature, carried out breath by breath, day by day, with no victory except the gentle miracle of waking to another morning. As the long freeze settled into its final, most unyielding phase, when even the daylight felt thin, stretched across the sky like a fragile film of pale gold, the mountain man began to understand that winter, in its quiet brutality, was not something that simply happened around him, but something he had slowly stepped inside of, something that had entered his bones, steadied his mind, thinned his fears, and woven itself into the deepest patterns of his days, until he no longer thought of survival as a task, but as a slow conversation carried out through breath, movement, and attention. He realized that the longer he lived in the cold, the more the wilderness stripped him of the unnecessary. His thoughts became simpler, not in the sense of being smaller, but in the sense of being purified. The mental clutter of obligations, expectations, regrets, and imagined futures had fallen away with each passing storm, leaving behind only the truths that mattered: warmth, shelter, sustenance, awareness. And with that simplicity came a kind of freedom he had never known before, a freedom not defined by what he could do, but by the quiet certainty of knowing what he needed. There were days when the wind came down from the ridges with a long, low moan, carrying flakes of snow that spun like drifting ash, and he felt as though the mountains were speaking in their old, untranslatable language, telling stories worn smooth by time, stories he would never fully understand but could feel in the way the cold pressed gently but insistently against him. On those days he walked slowly, leaning into the gusts, each step a test of balance and patience, and despite the sharp bite of the air against his skin, he felt strangely at peace, knowing that this vast, indifferent world had allowed him to endure yet another day within it. He noticed how even discomfort had changed its shape. The cold that once gnawed at him like a merciless predator now felt more like a stern companion, its presence constant but predictable, teaching him to move with intention rather than instinct, to choose steadiness over haste, to listen more carefully to the subtle messages his body sent before pain sharpened into warning. Hunger no longer frightened him because he had learned to read its signals. Fatigue no longer disturbed him because he had learned to rest before exhaustion overtook him. Solitude no longer weighed on him because it had transformed into a quiet presence that walked beside him like an old friend. Even his relationship with darkness evolved. What once felt like a heavy curtain falling too quickly now felt like a slow, respectful transition, a moment when the world softened its edges and offered him a chance to retreat into the small circle of light he created with his own hands. The night became less of a threat and more of a boundary, gentle, firm, enclosing him in a space where he could reflect without distraction, where he could hear the sigh of wind against the shelter walls, the faint crackle of cooling embers, the rhythmic pulse of his own breath, weaving itself into the quiet. Sometimes, as he sat near the fire with the night stretching endlessly beyond its glow, he felt an emotion that was difficult to name, something like gratitude, something like awe, something like a soft ache in the center of his chest, that came from understanding how small he was, and yet how entirely alive he felt in that smallness. The wilderness did not praise him for enduring, nor did it offer comfort for his struggles, but somehow the absence of validation made each moment of warmth, each bite of food, each hour of rest feel more profound, because they existed only because he made them exist. And in that recognition he began to see himself differently, not as a man fighting against the cold, but as a man learning from it, shaped by it, refined by the slow pressure of winter's lessons. The mountains did not care whether he survived, but they taught him how to, if he paid attention, and in that harsh, honest exchange he found a sense of meaning that was deeper than anything comfort could have given him. When he finally lay down beneath his furs each night, listening to the quiet settling of snow on the roof above him, he understood that winter had become more than a season. It had become a teacher, a mirror, a silent companion, and in its presence he had discovered the simple truth that endurance was not measured by strength alone, but by the patient, steady willingness to remain, one breath after another, in harmony with a world that owed him nothing, yet allowed him day by day to continue. As the first subtle signs of spring began to whisper their way into the frozen world, signs so delicate he might have missed them had he not learned to observe the land with patient, reverent attention, the mountain man found himself standing on the quiet edge between seasons, realizing that winter, with all its weight and silence and unspoken lessons, was finally loosening its grip, not with fanfare but with the same calm inevitability with which it had arrived. He noticed it in the way the snow softened underfoot, no longer the hardened crust that resisted every step but a damp, yielding layer hinting faintly at the earth beneath. He heard it in the distant dripping of meltwater sliding slowly from the branches, each drop falling with the patient rhythm of something waking from a deep sleep. He felt it in the air itself, still cold, still sharp, yet carrying a thread of warmth so faint it seemed almost imagined, a warmth that brushed against his cheek like a memory rather than a promise. And as he walked through this shifting landscape, he understood with a quiet clarity that surprised him that the man he had been when winter began was not the man he had become. The cold had shaped him not through suffering but through silence, not through hardship alone, but through the slow, deliberate stripping away of everything unnecessary until only the essential remained, the awareness that life at its core was built from simple acts repeated with care, from breath taken with intention, from the humble, steady acceptance of the world as it was rather than as he wished it to be. He felt stronger, though not in the way of force or muscle. He felt wiser, though not in the way of knowledge or words. He felt calmer, as though winter had placed its hand upon his chest and quieted something that had rattled inside him for years without his understanding. In the long hush of snow and wind and firelight, he had discovered a stillness that did not feel like emptiness but like fullness, a sense that nothing had been missing from his life except the ability to slow down long enough to feel the pulse of his own existence without distraction. And now, as the light lengthened and the shadows softened, he sensed winter receding not as an adversary defeated, but as a teacher taking its leave, satisfied that its lessons had settled deeply into him. He knew that harder days would come, storms, challenges, moments of fear or hunger or uncertainty, but he no longer feared them with the restless anxiety he once carried. He understood now that survival was not a test passed once, but a practice, a rhythm, a way of moving through the world with humility and presence. Standing on the ridge as the sun broke gently over the horizon, casting a pale gold glow across the snowfields, he felt a deep, grounding gratitude rise within him, not the loud gratitude of celebration, but the quiet, steady kind born from endurance, from breath, from the simple miracle of having lived another season beneath the vast sky. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft creak of the trees and the distant trickle of melting ice, and he allowed himself to feel the warmth of the sun on his face, a warmth so gentle it felt like a blessing. Winter had not spared him. It had shaped him. It had peeled back the noise, carved out the fear, steadied his breath, and left him standing in a place where he could finally see himself clearly, not as a conqueror of the wilderness, not as a victim of it, but as a part of it, one small living thing among countless others, enduring, learning, adapting, continuing. And as he began the slow walk back to his shelter, he understood that the truest gift of the cold was not survival but transformation, the quiet remaking of a man in the vast silence of the mountains, where each step, each breath, each flicker of firelight had carried him toward a deeper, quieter strength, one that would remain with him long after the snow melted, long after the winds softened, long after the mountains released him back into the rhythm of the world beyond. Because winter had taught him, in its patient, wordless way, that endurance is not the act of holding on, but the art of becoming, slowly, quietly, deeply, the person who can,